All across America and around the world, this is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fossone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including RSS.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative.
We want to welcome to Veterans Radio Tom Duffy, Navy commander, retired, U.S. Foreign Service diplomat of 32 years with postings pretty much all around the world, but for relevant purposes, time in the Middle East. Tom also has taught at the U.S. National War College in D.C. You got your undergrad from Notre Dame, where you were an ROTC candidate, and MA in War Studies at King's College, London, and a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College. Woo! What a background, Tom. Welcome to Veterans Radio.
Hey, thank you very much for having me today.
Well, we're going to combine your naval experience with your foreign service experience to talk about a book that you've written, Tanker War in the Gulf. It's right over your shoulder there, and it's an interesting story about Operation Earnest Will, which everybody's kind of probably forgotten about. But as they like to say, if you don't know your history, you repeat your history. And we're going to talk about how this relates to what's going on today. So, but Tom, give us a little bit of your naval history and a little bit of your foreign service history.
Yeah, thank you. So, I always tell people I was much more in danger in the Foreign Service than I ever was in the Navy. And that's just a function of where they send you and where it goes. So I ended up serving in Colombia, in the Foreign Service, and a lot of places in the Middle East. But in the Navy, so I graduated from college and got sent to the USS Cochrane, which is a destroyer home ported in Japan. And one day we're sitting there and we read in Stars and Stripes, because there's no internet at that point. We're just reading in Stars and Stripes about the strike on the USS Stark in the Persian Gulf. And 3 days later, we find ourselves steaming south to the Persian Gulf to get involved. What's going to become Earnest Will? And I think this is probably the case for all veterans, right? When you're involved in these operations, it's just sort of day to day for you, right? It's just like, this is what we do. It isn't until
nobody told you the big picture. You're what right. Are you, a Lieutenant JG or something?
Right, I'm
like
a Lieutenant JG at the time, right?
Yeah, they're not explaining to you why you're going. You're just going, right?
Right, and so and I don't need to know the big picture to do my job. I'm the missile officer. The missile officer and the fire control officer. Our job is to make radar go away, as they like to say.
Yeah.
So I don't really need to know all of this. But afterwards, I get out of the Navy and I don't know what to do next. And I decided just to go to the University of London, mainly because in college, all these people had gone to London for a semester, which I couldn't do because of my ROTC commitments. And they were just insufferable with their stories. So I said, I'm going to go to London too. And so I ended up in a master's program that turns out to be a lot more reputable than I realized. And I have to write on something. And so my friends at King say, hey, you've just come back from Earnest Will. Why don't you write on that? And so I did my master's thesis on that. And then, 35 years later, a book.
Well, and again, it's one of those things that when you're in the middle of it, you don't see the big picture.
Right.
35 years later, there's a lot of big picture to understand because you can grab a lot of research and history. And as I say, it relates a little bit to what's going on today. So let's refresh people. Tell folks about what Operation Earnest Will was about in 1987.
Sure. So it starts back even a little earlier. So in 1980, Saddam Hussein invades Iran. Just as a reminder of how unpredictable and dangerous Saddam Hussein was. And so in 1980, he invades Iran. In 1990, he invades Kuwait. But in the meantime, we have this war, this tanker war going on. So so the Iran-Iraq war runs from 1980 to 1988. It goes on a really long time. And so economics become really important. The countries of the Southern Gulf are supporting Saddam because they don't want to get taken over by the Iranians. And so the Iranians start to attack the economic underpinnings of support for the Iraqis. And this means they're attacking Kuwaiti and Saudi tankers. And so by 1986, the Kuwaitis come to the Soviet Union and the United States and say, hey, can you reflag our tankers in an effort to try and keep the Iranians from attacking the tankers? Now, the bigger picture for the Kuwaitis is usually in the Cold War, when you had a major conflict, either the Soviet or the Union or the United States would take sides. We didn't in this case. The unofficial line was that, both sides are so bad. It's just a pity they both can't lose. And the Soviets aren't very different in practice on this. So both the superpowers stay out of this war. But the Kuwaitis, make us an offer we can't refuse, mainly because we're trying to keep the Soviets out. So we agree to do this. So from the start, we realized that this is a sideshow, that the major war is actually the Iranians and the Iraqis, that we're engaging in a sideshow is what the Navy staff calls it. And so we are going to escort these Kuwaiti tankers. And so the sense is that the very sight of the Stars and Stripes flying on the stern of a Kuwaiti tanker will deter the Iranians from attacking, and that did not turn out to be the case whatsoever.
It's hard to get into the mind of somebody who's irrational, right? Who has a totally different approach.
This is the point, isn't it? So separately, there's an article in the October 2025 proceedings I've also written, which talks about how unreliable deterrence is as a strategic concept. And I guess right to your point, that it's so difficult for us to get into the mind of our opponents that it is ludicrous for us to base a strategy of deterrence on anything, because you're basically trying to politically predict what your opponent's going to do. And we fail time and time again. So arguably we fail in this one as well. So the first Earnest Will mission, the Iranians mine the strait. So they don't mine the strait actually. They mine the approaches to Kuwait harbor. So we had been ready for attacks. We've been ready for air attacks and surface-to-surface missile attacks and small boat attacks, but we hadn't really focused on mines. And so these poor guys, so we were out in the Gulf of Oman. We're protecting the Constellation. We're a shotgun. So we're not actually part of the convoy effort. So our colleagues are out there, convoying these two tankers all the way through the Persian Gulf, which takes a couple of days. It's high stress. The weather conditions are awful. The radar propagation is difficult. So they're on a high rate of stress. And so they're pulling into Kuwait harbor and they think, okay, this is finished. We've succeeded. And suddenly a mine goes off. It hits the Bridgeton, which is an enormous super tanker. The U.S. ships just sort of form a conga line behind it because while the Bridgeton can take a hit, the small boys can't. And so we go in. So it's interesting. We ran 45 Earnest Will convoys over the next 45 over the next year and a half. That was the only actual convoy that got attacked. So in that sense, these convoy missions, and so the operational name for the convoy escort mission was called Operation Earnest Will. The original name for the operation was Operation Private Jewels, which some bright spark realized is a terrible thing to put out in public. They renamed it Earnest Will. And so that mission itself, the convoy mission, was extremely successful in that only one convoy was ever attacked, and that was the first one.
And it's interesting that, the idea was, hey, we're going to attack merchant tankers to put economic pressure on Kuwait and other countries along the Gulf there. Boy, that sounds kind of familiar.
Right.
And you say it was a sideshow. Naval battles or naval fights, you talk about it in the book, are a lot different, more limited liability warfare at sea than what you have on land. And that was a little bit of what was going on in the late 1980s in this particular Ernest Will operation. These were all being calculated as to like, how much do we do? What's a responsible or proportional response? A lot of that strategy or thought process had to go on, didn't it?
It did, and you raise an important point, right? So in a sense, you're doing this in a linear fashion, that I need to get a tanker from point A to point B. And I'm going to chart my course, and I'm going to give it air cover and surface ship cover and that sort of stuff. And so if I apply enough destroyers and frigates and air cover, then this should work. Except we're talking about war, right? Which is, once the violence starts, it's a non-linear process. It becomes non-linear, chaotic, and unpredictable. So these dynamics are at play all through Ernest Will, that we have an idea of what we're doing, but there's so much chance in this that it's what ends up driving the war. And again, arguably, the Ernest Will is bookended by two accidental missile strikes. So the first one is the accidental missile strike against USS Stark, in which Iraqis, rather than the Iranians, it's an Iraqi aircraft that fires off two Exocet missiles and kills 37 sailors aboard the USS Stark. So there's no sense that that wasn't accidental, but does really get our focus. We really have the focus on Ernest Will then. And then the operation essentially ends, and the war ends when the USS Vincennes accidentally shoots down a civilian airliner in 1988, which provides the pretext for the Iranians to end the entire Iran-Iraq war. So the Iranians were quite clear on this in accepting a Security Council resolution 598, which ends the war. They specifically cited the USS Vincennes. From the Iranians' perspective, and they've been consistent, they think we deliberately shot down that airliner and that we would be engaged in, quote unquote, immense crimes going forward if the Iranians did not end the war. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the Iranians were losing the war by 1988. This provided a useful pretext. But the presence of the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf, which was there to protect weighty tankers, ended up inadvertently helping to end the entire war.
Yeah, it sort of two accidents start and end,
right?
And maybe both accidents are pretexts, face-saving methods to find an end.
Yeah, well, certainly the latter one is, but it just is a reminder of the role of contingency and chance in war, because we didn't intend to end the war by doing this.
And you write about this, page 75, about mission creep, reaction. You just sort of have to react to the realities that are going on, and that may take your mission in a direction you weren't even planning on, right?
Right. Once the violence starts, yeah. So I don't think it's any accident that people use fire to describe war. So fire is useful. You can build things, you can heat things, and that sort of stuff. And so you're trying to use fire to create things and to do things. But fire can get out of control, right? It leaps its fire boundaries, and suddenly the fire does stuff that you hadn't predicted. I think that's why people so often liken fire to war.
You talk about and it was used. I don't know if it was used on both sides, but the mining of the shipping lanes, and it's not like that wasn't planned on, because there was a whole effort to then send minesweepers.
Right.
But talk a little bit about that. Now, again, we're in the 1980s. We're not talking about what's going on in 2026 yet,
right.
But it's, I want veteran radio listeners to understand from Tom Duffy here, with all of his experience, both as a Navy commander and in the Foreign Service, this is stuff people knew about. The idea that nobody thought about, oh, maybe they'll mine the shipping lanes. So talk to us a little bit about, was that a surprise back in the 80s?
It's interesting. So the CIA actually does some studies on this. And so they look, there's been a series of mining incidents in the Middle East in the 80s by the Libyans in the Red Sea and that sort of stuff. And so the Iranians are watching this and understanding that, hey, this is a deniable form of warfare, and we might be able to do this. But a 1984 declassified CIA assessment says that the Iranians would be unlikely to use that against us because we would be likely to come up with retribution against them. And so we guessed wrong on this. But so there was a sense that, yeah, you could use mines. We also, this is part of the 600 ship Navy, right? And so we had programmed into the 600 ship Navy mine hunters, the Osprey class and these other types of coastal minesweepers. But, even now we have problems getting our ships produced on time. And that was the case in the 1970s and 1980s as well. We had great minesweepers and mine hunters designed and paid for, but we had problems getting them out on time. And so when the Bridgeton hits a mine, it's a bit of a surprise, but not a complete surprise. But we don't have any minesweeping assets except in the reserves. We go to the Europeans asking for some help. The Europeans want nothing to do with what is shaping up to be a U.S. versus Iran fight, and they initially decline our requests. So we end up calling all these old minesweepers out from the reserves. It takes forever to get there. But once they do get there, these 1950s minesweepers, right? But they're sweeping Iranian mines which are based on a World War I design. So in terms of once the minesweepers actually get there, they're actually quite effective in taking out these old types of mines.
The other thing that you write about that was happening as a small boat activity, bog hammers, I think is what they're referred to. And again, this is 40 years ago, but sounds familiar today. Talk to us a little bit about, again, was the U.S. Navy surprised by this in back in the day, or was this, we've got to plan around this? What's the best way to deal with it?
Right. And so it's interesting. So I'd argue it isn't a surprise. In fact, in the 1980s, we were much more ready for the small boat attacks than we were the mines. And so it's bog hammers, which are sort of these long Swedish produced speedboats. There's also Boston whalers, like your normal Boston whaler that has arms on it. And so we respond a couple different ways. One, we up armor, we bring additional weapons onto the ships. So we bring more 50 cals, the 25 millimeter Bushmasters we're putting on the sides of the ships because they're more effective than the 5-inch in going after these small types of points. So we're, getting ready for this particular threat. But there's a lot of them. And, for those of you who've sailed out in the Gulf, the weather's awful. The visibility is terrible. There's a lot of traffic. And so it's easy for these ships to blend in with the dhows and everything else that's out there. So the chance of surprise attack is really, really high. So it's a real stressor for our guys who are running these convoys, and it's a tribute to them that they were, except for that first convoy, every other Ernest Will convoy was successfully protected all the way through.
Yeah, that right there is an amazing stat, probably lost on most of the general public. But you commented a minute ago, and again, this is history that it ripples forward, or at least rhymes going forward, and that is the burden sharing issue. Back in this particular campaign, it wasn't, burden sharing really wasn't all that shared, was it?
So, but it's an interesting point of comparison of contrast. So, in 1987, we realized even before Bridgeton gets hit that we're deficient in some areas, including minesweepers. And so, in May of 1987, Caspar Weinberger is our Secretary of Defense. Now, Caspar Weinberger is not known for being the most solicitous of fellows. I mean, his nickname in the Nixon administration as the OMB budget director was Cap the Knife.
Right.
So he's known for being confrontational when he needs to and that sort of stuff. So Weinberger goes to the May 1987 NATO ministerial and he asks for assistance, and he puts it in the context of freedom of navigation. And it's not an official NATO ask. So he's not asking NATO to provide forces. Rather, he's asking the member states of NATO in their individual capacity to consider sending forces out. Now, this is 1987. The Cold War is still going on. NATO is big into the idea of out of area, right? And so for the NATO folks, for the Americans, look, the Cold War was global. It was there's no such thing as out of area for the United States Navy. But for the Europeans, NATO was regional, and it was focused on Western Europe. So when we asked them to participate something in the Gulf, their initial response was out of area. So this is way before Afghanistan or Iraq or these types of things. So in 1987, NATO's focused on the Soviet Union, and they're reluctant to operate outside that NATO operating area. But so Weinberger's not making an official ask of NATO, but he's kind of hitting these countries country by country. They initially decline, and Weinberger plays this extremely well. So in his press remarks to the press as he leaves, it's like, hey, we didn't expect to come here with a satchel and filling it on out. So he was measured and tempered in his discussions of the NATO allies. So as the summer goes on, the Iranians start to indiscriminately mine areas, and they mine a place called Khor-Fakkan, which is outside the Persian Gulf. It's off the it's off an Emirati port, but it's in the Gulf of Oman. So the Europeans say, hey, wait a minute, we have all these mines which could hit anything. They're not in the Persian Gulf anymore. And also, I think they had second thoughts about being seen to be not helping the United States. Again, Cold War, you're sending a signal to the Soviet Union. So Margaret Thatcher gets, there's an election in Britain in like June of 1987, and she gets a significant majority. She now is in a position to take more risky political decisions. And so she's looking at this. She's looking at indiscriminate Iranian mining. She's looking at the Iran-Contra scandal, which is going on. The hearings are going on all summer at the same time. She's looking at her genuine friendship with Ronald Reagan. I mean, these two are very close. And so Margaret Thatcher writes about this in her memoirs, which is, I needed to help my friend out. And so she overrules her government and sends state-of-the-art minesweepers to the Persian Gulf. The other countries of Western Europe take a look at this, and you sort of get this succession of Me Too.
Right. Don't want to be left out.
Right. So they all end up sending their minesweepers, but it's national. So the French are operating by themselves. The Belgians and the Dutch are operating by themselves. The Italians are running it by themselves. They're careful publicly to say in capital that this isn't coordinated. We're just there. We're all operating. But at the operational level, on the water, these ships and these crews are able to work very effectively together.
Well, they also don't want to be running into each other or any of those sorts of things. I'm going to use this provision of your book, Tanker War in the Gulf, to turn us to current events, because you write, events drive policy. Policy versus policy driving events. This is at page 128 of the book. And it's like, I wrote that one down. I said, oh boy, this is right where we turn. So here we are in 2026. We find ourselves in the midst of another Iran war. It's got all kinds of land, Air Force, sky issues, dominance of the airspace. But in the middle of all that other stuff is we're fighting again over who controls the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, mining, bog hammers. As you look at it today, with that history and knowledge, Tom Duffy, tell us what you're thinking.
Sure. Let's go over the similarities and the differences. There's a couple similarities. The same geographical area, same players largely, some of the same sea control threats, missiles, gunfire, mines. We have the same political split between the Europeans and the Americans regarding how best to deal with the Iranians. And then lately, the fight has become the fight for which Operation Earnest Will was articulated, freedom of the seas. So after Stark gets hit, and we lose 37 sailors in this attack, Ronald Reagan goes on national TV and says, hey, look, it's important that freedom of the seas is not an empty cliche. It's important that we do this. So this idea of maintaining freedom of the seas and unrestricted passage to the Strait of Hormuz, same fight. But let's turn to the differences. Yeah, they're the same players, but the players are playing different roles. So in 1987 and 1988, Iran was principally fighting Iraq. Their goal was not to bring the United States in. So they could have targeted us with silkworms and done a lot more damage, but they were arguably pulling their punches. And similarly, we struck a very limited Iranian target set. We didn't hit on land. We did not. There were moves or proposals to hit like the Iranian naval headquarters in Bandar Abbas, to take out the land-based silkworm sites and such. So the operators in the region, where understandably would make these recommendations, and Washington would think about it and not do it. So that's gone. So I mean, we're clearly, there's no question that we're fighting each other on this in a way that was not the case in 1987, 88. we have just described kind of a kaleidoscope of war aims, from regime change to unconditional surrender to we're kind of on cease nuclear enrichment. I'd argue, we should probably be making more of a focus on freedom of navigation. It's a centuries-old thing for us. Another difference is that those decapitation strikes against the Iranians have left them so decentralized that it's not clear who has the last word on anything in Iran, which is going to complicate your negotiations. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has always been a wild card. It was a wild card in 87 and 88 too. But and now they're just doing stuff that is, I think they just have decentralized execution orders and they're carrying them out, which really complicates things. Some other differences in weapons. We have drones now. The mines are much better. So my colleague Steve Phillips has just put out a book called Poison Chalice. Steve's the next EOD guy. It really gets into the mine threat, the growing mine threat, the ways we can counter on this. But that's different. But this is what we would call a character of war change. So the nature of war is always the same. It's violence. It's unpredictable. It's political. The character of war change is how we fight it. We have a character of war change going on with this fight. Much greater economic impact here. You have the International Energy Agency warning that this is much, much worse than what we saw in the 1970s. We're already seeing some impact in East Asia economies. There's widespread expectation of inflation. That wasn't the case in 87. We actually had an oil glut going on. And during the fight, there was never an interruption to the Strait of Hormuz. It's nothing like you see today. Another difference, the force structure is different. Navy force structure. We were the 600-ship Navy in 1987. We are less than half the size of that now. So our weapons are more sophisticated and in many ways better, but we just don't have the same number of hulls. We have less than half the number of hulls. So if you were to do a convoy mission, which is really numbers intensive, right? You just don't have the assets to do it like you did before. And then finally, this is both a similarity and a difference. We get back to the freedom of navigation point. So there's a British naval historian who I studied under, King's, Geoffrey Till, and he observed that, quote, to the great maritime powers, the sea stands for opportunity and freedom. The competing view to this is characteristic of national states of a continental persuasion, who tend to think of the sea in rather the same way they think of land. The sea may sometimes be a source of danger and strategic vulnerability. And so that's what we see going on here. This is a classic fight between a maritime power of the United States and a continental power of the Iranians. Now, for a good 250 years, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the establishment of the United States Navy right now. We've always pushed for freedom of the seas, for the ability of ships, and especially trading ships, to be able to go wherever they need to go. So that's what's at jeopardy here. So the stakes are just enormous.
Yeah, it is similar and dissimilar at the same time. And the whole idea of freedom of the seas also brings in some echo of what's going on over in China and our issues in the North China, or I should say South China Sea.
Right. Exactly.
Hopefully another book you're looking at and another discussion we can have. But we're talking to Tom Duffy. I can refer to him as Commander. I can refer to him, actually his title in the Foreign Service was Minister Counselor. That's pretty cool. I don't know how you get that on a business card. But yep. He's written a book that by Casemate Publishers called Tanker War in the Gulf, Operation Earnest Will, Diplomacy and Sea Power in Practice. And it just is so timely and provides a history to give us a backdrop of what's going on today with our current problems. Maybe they're always old problems coming back, aren't they, Tom?
I didn't mean for this to be a timely book, right? This is supposed to be a history book, but these challenges just keep coming up again and again.
Well, we appreciate the time you've been able to give us today on Veterans Radio and encourage folks who not only want to know the history book, but maybe a glimpse at how this impacts life today to go out and grab a copy of Tanker War in the Gulf. Tom, thanks for your time today.
Jim, thanks for the chance to talk this morning.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Faussone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800
or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows
by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.